A classified Pentagon briefing from 2019 contained just 7 words that sent shockwaves through America's military establishment. China has lost the Philippines. Strategy failed completely. How does the world's most powerful authoritarian regime lose an entire archipelago nation without a war being declared, without sanctions being imposed, without a single diplomatic crisis making international headlines? The answer lies in the most brilliant strategic deception of our time, where 7,000 islands convinced Beijing they were weak and compliant, while secretly orchestrating the complete dismantling of China's South China Sea ambitions. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you understand power, strategy, and the art of winning without fighting. Before we dive into this incredible story of David versus Goliath politics, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't miss the jaw-dropping tactics we're about to uncover. The year was 2012, and China had just made a move that would change everything. Without warning, Chinese Coast Guard vessels surrounded Scarborough Shoal, a fishing ground that sits just 120 miles from the Philippine mainland. For generations, Filipino fishermen had worked these waters, following routes their grandfathers had taught them. But suddenly, they found themselves staring down the barrels of water cannons operated by ships that could crush their entire fleet without breaking a sweat. China wasn't just fishing here anymore. They were claiming ownership of the entire area, and they had the firepower to enforce it. What happened in those tense waters wasn't an isolated incident. It was the opening move in China's master plan to control the South China Sea, a body of water that holds secrets worth trillions of dollars. Beneath these waves lie oil reserves that could power entire nations for decades, natural gas deposits that make energy companies salivate, and fishing grounds that feed millions of people across Asia. But here's the kicker. Every year, $35 trillion worth of global trade passes through these waters. Control the South China Sea, and you control a massive chunk of the world's economy. China's strategy was as audacious as it was illegal under international law. They deployed massive dredging ships that worked around the clock, pumping sand and rock from the seafloor to create artificial islands where none had existed before. Fiery Cross Reef became a 680-acre military fortress with runways capable of launching fighter jets. Subi Reef sprouted radar installations and missile systems seemingly overnight. Mischief Reef, once a simple fishing ground, now housed airstrips long enough for military bombers. Within months, 7 coral reefs had transformed into 7 military bases, all designed to project Chinese power across international waters. The Philippines watched this transformation with growing alarm, but they faced an impossible situation. China's military budget was nearly 50 times larger than theirs. The Chinese Navy boasted aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, and destroyers that could level entire coastal cities. A direct military confrontation would have been national suicide. Traditional diplomacy had failed spectacularly, with Chinese officials simply ignoring Philippine protests and international concerns. The world's second-largest economy was playing by its own rules, and those rules involved taking whatever they wanted. But here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Instead of backing down or escalating militarily, the Philippines chose a completely different battlefield. They decided to fight China in court. In January 2013, the Philippines filed a case with the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, challenging China's sweeping territorial claims under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This wasn't just any legal challenge. This was a small nation taking the world's most powerful authoritarian regime to international court, knowing full well that China would fight back with everything they had. China's response was swift and brutal. They imposed economic sanctions on Philippine exports, particularly bananas and other agricultural products that Filipino farmers depended on for their livelihoods. Chinese tourists, who had become a crucial source of income for Philippine resorts and hotels, suddenly stopped coming. Investment projects were mysteriously delayed or canceled. The message was clear: challenge China and face the economic consequences. But the Philippines had anticipated this retaliation. and they had prepared for it in ways that would make Sun Tzu proud. While China was focused on economic pressure, the Philippines was quietly building something far more valuable: international support. The first ally to step forward was Japan, a nation that had its own territorial disputes with China and understood exactly what the Philippines was facing. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe began coordinating maritime security initiatives, sharing intelligence, and providing advanced surveillance equipment. Australia quickly followed, offering naval cooperation and diplomatic support. Even European nations, thousands of miles away from the South China Sea, began sending warships through the contested waters to demonstrate their commitment to international law. But the most significant partnership was with the United States. The Philippines-U.S. relationship had been complicated for decades, marked by colonial history and political tensions. However, the Chinese threat created an opportunity for both nations to rebuild their alliance on more equal terms. Joint military exercises expanded dramatically, with American forces training Filipino troops in advanced maritime defense tactics. Intelligence sharing agreements allowed the Philippines to track Chinese military movements with unprecedented precision. Most importantly, the Mutual Defense Treaty between the two countries was reaffirmed, sending a clear message to Beijing that an attack on the Philippines would mean war with America. While building military partnerships, the Philippines was simultaneously executing a diplomatic masterpiece through ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. For years, China had successfully prevented ASEAN from taking a unified stance on South China Sea disputes, using their economic influence to keep individual member countries in line. But the Philippines changed the game by reframing the issue. Instead of presenting this as a bilateral dispute between China and the Philippines, they positioned it as a threat to all Southeast Asian nations' sovereignty and economic interests. Vietnam, which had its own territorial disputes with China, immediately recognized the strategic value of this approach. Malaysia and Brunei, both claimants to parts of the South China Sea, began coordinating their positions with the Philippines. Even nations without direct territorial claims, like Thailand and Singapore, understood that Chinese control over these waters would threaten their trade routes and economic security. For the first time in decades, ASEAN presented a united front against Chinese aggression, transforming what had been a series of isolated disputes into a regional security crisis. The Philippines also recognized that modern conflicts aren't won only through military might or diplomatic maneuvering. They're won through information warfare. And this is where Filipino strategy became truly innovative. Every incident of Chinese aggression was meticulously documented with photos, videos, and GPS coordinates. Fishermen were equipped with cameras and communication devices to record harassment by Chinese vessels. Government ships carried sophisticated recording equipment to capture evidence of illegal activities in Philippine territorial waters. This documentation served multiple purposes. First, it provided irrefutable evidence for the international arbitration case, making it impossible for China to deny their aggressive actions. Second, it created a constant stream of content for international media, keeping the South China Sea dispute in global headlines and maintaining international pressure on China. Third, it demonstrated to the Filipino people that their government was actively defending their interests, building domestic support for the strategy, even when economic costs were high. The economic dimension of Philippine strategy was equally sophisticated. Recognizing that overdependence on Chinese trade made them vulnerable to economic coercion, the Philippines began an aggressive diversification campaign. Japanese companies were courted to replace Chinese investors in infrastructure projects. Korean manufacturers were offered incentives to establish production facilities that had previously been dominated by Chinese firms. American and European businesses found new opportunities in sectors where Chinese companies had enjoyed preferential treatment. This economic diversification wasn't just about reducing vulnerability. It was about creating alternatives that made Chinese economic pressure less effective. When China restricted Philippine banana imports, new markets opened in Japan and the Middle East. When Chinese tourists stopped visiting, marketing campaigns in Australia and America attracted visitors who spent more money per capita. The Philippines discovered that reducing dependence on China actually opened up opportunities they had never explored before. Meanwhile, something extraordinary was happening in the international legal arena. The arbitration case was proceeding despite Chinese attempts to discredit and ignore the process. Legal experts from around the world were examining the evidence, and it was becoming clear that China's position was legally indefensible. The so-called nine-dash line that China used to claim almost the entire South China Sea had no basis in international law. The artificial islands were built on submerged features that couldn't support territorial claims. The harassment of Filipino fishermen violated multiple international agreements that China had signed. On July 12, 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration delivered its verdict, and it was a complete victory for the Philippines. The court ruled that China's nine-dash line claim had no legal basis, that China had violated Philippines' sovereign rights, and that China's artificial island construction had caused severe environmental damage to coral reef ecosystems. The decision was comprehensive, detailed, and impossible to dismiss as biased or politically motivated. China's response revealed the fundamental weakness in their strategy. They immediately rejected the ruling, calling it a piece of waste paper and insisting they would not be bound by international law. This reaction backfired spectacularly, confirming to the international community that China was indeed an aggressive power that respected only force, not legal principles. Nations that had previously remained neutral in the dispute began choosing sides, and they weren't choosing China. But legal victories, no matter how comprehensive, only matter if they can be enforced. This is where the Philippines revealed the most brilliant aspect of their strategy. They never intended to enforce the ruling through military action or economic sanctions. Instead, they used the legal victory as a foundation for building an even stronger coalition of nations committed to containing Chinese expansion. The United States began conducting freedom of navigation operations with increasing frequency, sending warships through areas that China claimed as territorial waters. Each transit was carefully coordinated with the Philippines and other regional allies, demonstrating that the international community would not accept China's illegal claims. European nations joined these operations, with British, French, and German vessels making high-profile passages through the South China Sea. Japan announced major increases in defense spending specifically to counter Chinese aggression, while simultaneously expanding economic partnerships with the Philippines and other Southeast Asian nations. Australia committed to maintaining a permanent naval presence in the region, working closely with Philippine forces to monitor Chinese activities. India, recognizing that Chinese control of Southeast Asian sea routes would threaten Indian trade and security, began coordinating maritime patrols with ASEAN navies. Perhaps most importantly, the Philippines succeeded in making the South China Sea dispute a global issue rather than a regional one. Every major power now had a stake in preventing Chinese dominance of these waters. The European Union passed resolutions supporting the arbitration ruling. The G7 issued statements defending international law in the South China Sea. Even African and Latin American nations, influenced by their own concerns about Chinese economic coercion, began supporting the Philippine position in international forums. The economic impact of this international pressure began to affect Chinese calculations in ways that military threats never could. Foreign businesses became more cautious about investments in Chinese-controlled areas of the South China Sea, recognizing the legal and reputational risks. Insurance companies raised premiums for ships operating in disputed waters claimed by China. International development banks refused to finance projects on artificial islands built in violation of international law. You're witnessing something unprecedented here, a complete masterclass in how smart strategy can overcome raw power. If this analysis is opening your eyes to how international relations really work, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into the stories that are reshaping our world. By 2020, the strategic landscape had fundamentally shifted. China still controlled the artificial islands they had built, but their position had become politically and economically unsustainable. The Philippines had transformed from an isolated victim of aggression into the leader of a global coalition committed to defending international law and preventing authoritarian expansion. Chinese actions that had once been dismissed as regional disputes were now viewed as threats to the entire international order. The COVID-19 pandemic provided an unexpected opportunity for the Philippines to demonstrate the practical benefits of their strategy. While nations dependent on Chinese supply chains struggled with shortages and economic disruption, the Philippines' diversified economic partnerships provided resilience and alternatives. Japanese investment in Philippine manufacturing increased dramatically as companies sought alternatives to Chinese production. American businesses relocated operations to the Philippines, attracted by the strategic partnership and stable legal environment. The Philippines also leveraged their position to become a leader in regional security cooperation. The Balacadan exercises with the United States expanded to include forces from Australia, Japan, and other allies, creating an interoperable military network capable of coordinating responses to Chinese aggression. Intelligence sharing agreements allowed real-time tracking of Chinese military movements, eliminating the element of surprise that China had relied on for their initial expansion. Most significantly, the Philippines succeeded in changing the fundamental narrative around the South China Sea dispute. What had once been portrayed as an inevitable result of Chinese power was now recognized as a choice, a test of whether the international community would defend the legal principles that guarantee smaller nations' rights to exist and prosper without domination by larger neighbors. The true measure of Philippine success became clear in 2023, when China began sending mixed signals about potential negotiations regarding the dispute. After years of refusing to acknowledge the arbitration ruling, Chinese officials began hinting at possible diplomatic solutions that would respect some Philippine claims. This wasn't a sudden change of heart. It was recognition that their aggressive strategy had failed to achieve its objectives while imposing significant costs on Chinese interests. The Philippines had achieved something that seemed impossible when the crisis began. They had forced China to recalculate the costs and benefits of their South China Sea expansion. Not through military confrontation or economic warfare, but through patient construction of legal, diplomatic, and strategic alternatives that made Chinese aggression counterproductive. Today, Filipino fishermen still face harassment in disputed waters, and Chinese military installations still occupy artificial islands built in violation of international law. But the fundamental balance of power has shifted. The Philippines is no longer alone, China is no longer unopposed, and the international community is no longer passive. A nation of 7,000 islands proved that strategic thinking, patient diplomacy, and principled alliances could challenge the world's second-largest economy without firing a single shot. The lesson extends far beyond the South China Sea. In an era when authoritarian powers seem to be gaining strength and democratic values appear under threat, the Philippines demonstrated that smaller nations still have options. They showed that international law still matters when enforced through coordinated action. They proved that economic diversification and strategic partnerships can provide security that military spending alone cannot guarantee. If you've made it this far, you clearly appreciate in-depth analysis of the forces reshaping our world. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our investigations into the stories that mainstream media overlooks. The Philippines didn't just defend their territorial waters. They defended the principle that might doesn't make right in international relations. They turned China's strength into weakness by forcing them to operate in arenas where size and military power provided no advantage. They transformed isolation into leadership by building coalitions that served everyone's interests except those of the aggressor. This remarkable story of strategic victory continues to evolve, with new challenges and developments constantly emerging. But the foundation has been established. A small nation proved that intelligence, persistence, and principle can triumph over aggression and intimidation. The The Philippines outsmarted China without firing a single shot. And in doing so, they provided a blueprint that other nations facing similar challenges are already beginning to follow. The South China Sea remains contested, but the Philippines ensured it will never be conquered. That victory belongs not just to one nation, but to the idea that in our interconnected world, no country should have to face giants alone.